Tom, we just got through one of your favorite holidays, Halloween.
Second favorite.
What's your first favorite?
Independence Day.
Okay.
That's
fair.
I love everything about Independence Day because I love the summer. I love the heat. I love what Independence Day represents. I love everything about Independence Day. So it's way up there. But number two is Halloween.
It's Halloween.
I love Halloween. The history of Halloween, I mean, it goes all the way back to these ancient Celtic rituals where, you know, when you think of primitive human beings, the sun starts getting lower and lower in the sky. It seems to be going away, and all the leaves are falling, or everything's dying. They were convinced that the spirit of death was at hand. They had good reason to think that. And if death is here, that means a lot of dead people, including dead people who might have a beef with you. And so there were two things. Number one, they wanted to hide. They wanted to disguise themselves so that death couldn't recognize who they were. And sometimes you might need to put out bribes for the dead souls so they don't come seek revenge. And thus the origin of Halloween and dressing up, and
I never knew that.
Oh yeah, it's very much rooted in the seasons.
Did you have any trick-or-treaters come by?
Just a few. We didn't get home till late. I didn't get to enjoy Halloween as I typically do. It was kind of a sad occasion. A good friend, D.K. Williams, passed away recently. A lot of people who listen to this podcast knew him very unexpectedly. And Halloween that afternoon, that was his memorial service.
Right.
I spoke at the service, and we stuck around in good fashion, living up to DK. We all went out for beers afterwards. That was one of his favorite things to do.
Yeah,
I'm reminded, my old friend DK Williams had this great line, which is very true, and it's very fitting, and it's very relevant to everything we do here at the Vino Veritas Society, and that is, freedom is dangerous. Live dangerously. Right. He loved to say that, sort of taunting people. Come on, live dangerously. And when you kind of unpack that, what it means, freedom is dangerous because it means you're making your own choices. It means you're going out into the world, and to live freely is to live as an adult, responsible human beings. You decide what kind of risks you want to take or not take, which means you're also going to accept the consequences of those risks. In some cases, if you're a successful entrepreneur, it might be a wonderful experience, risking a lot, and then the result is a bunch of success. Mm-hmm. But it can also mean terrible, miserable failure, falling flat on your face, maybe over and over again. And in a way, this is what freedom really boils down to. The two basic alternatives are, we can either live as perpetual children, and we can pretend like those in government are our parents and our overseers and our providers and protectors, or we can live as mature adult human beings and make our own choices and try to get along in life, try to pursue happiness best that we can. And if we choose the latter, which I should say this too, the latter is a rare thing historically. When you look throughout history, I think the story of human history, with rare exceptions, the story of human history basically is the story of human beings wanting to live like children. And they're always looking for somebody who will stand up and say, I'll be your daddy, I'll be your mommy, I'll be your provider, protector. And sometimes they called themselves Pharaoh or Caesar or king or emperor. They had all kinds of fancy titles. But those titles really represent a kind of parental figure.
Right.
We're going to look over you. We're going to protect you. We're going to provide for you. I'm convinced that same sort of that innate primordial desire to live as children is the origin of a lot of religions. Certainly a lot of the false religions. Right? How is it that history has so many false religions, so many untrue, illegitimate religions? Because there's a lot of people out there desperate for anyone who will stand there and say, I'll take care of you. I'll be your provider and protector.
It's the foundation of cults.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I mean, you look back through the history of cults and not even necessarily just religions, but people are saying, I am too afraid to live freely. I am too afraid of the risks that are out there. I want to know that there's somebody who's going to take care of me, who's going to make sure I'm safe. And then you get the Charlie Mansons who lead cults.
That's right.
And end up eating all their members.
That's right.
Right? I mean, it's sick.
Well, what was the group? I forget the name. They this is late 70s, early 80s. They went down. Was it Central America, South America? They all committed suicide by drinking the Kool-Aid.
Right.
It's where that phrase
Where's
comes
that
from.
Right.
You know, they drank the Kool-Aid. So, I mean, I think this is right. I think most people, it's a scary thing to venture out into the world and say, I'm going to be on my own, or maybe I'm going to rely on the people around me. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but it's worth throwing out. When you think of ordinary people who find the world to be scary, and they are looking for a protector and a provider, and then you contrast that with just how rare the real pioneer spirit is. The person or the group of people who, whether it's setting sail in a ship, or setting out in a covered wagon and a couple of horses and going out into some kind of wilderness and not knowing what they're going to run into, right? Not actually knowing what's out there.
Let's put that in modern context. Going to space.
Yeah, going to space.
Right? I mean, the pioneer mentality didn't end in the 1800s when we kind of covered the entire United States.
Right.
Elon Musk has a pioneer mentality.
Right.
He's going out, he's inventing new things, he's trying to explore space, he's trying to go cultivate Mars. I mean, that's a pioneer attitude.
Well, it's funny. What was the line from the old original Star Trek TV series?
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
Infinitive. And I say that because you like split infinitives, Dave. To boldly go where no man has gone before, right? Now, you're blazing a new trail, and it means by definition you're on your own. There's nobody there to provide for you, to protect you. So that's sort of the other end of the spectrum, you know, the pioneer spirit of going out into your own. And freedom requires a lot of that kind of attitude, that kind of spirit.
Take that a step further, and this is a little precursor to, I think, what we want to get really deep into today that we promised last week. But happiness requires risk. Happiness requires freedom. Are you going to be happy in a relationship, for example, right? Forget all the other things. Are you going to be happy in a relationship that you have to have somebody overseeing both of you who's watching you all the time to make sure you don't hurt each other and to make sure, or are you going to be happy taking the risk of putting your trust into somebody else? Think about this for a minute.
Here, make it even say, you don't even need a third party. How about just being in a relationship where the other person controls you, right? Effectively enslaves you? Is that likely to lead to happiness for you?
I think the answer is obviously not. And I think that the key to what I was getting at was that person would say, see, there's always one person trying to take advantage of the other.
Right.
So I need a mommy or daddy figure to be watching our relationship and telling us how to act, which is where government comes in. And could you imagine these people who are afraid of living freely?
We almost got there. I'm going to remind people of a kind of a sad moment in American history, and I think most Americans have forgotten this. When George W. Bush was first elected, and George W. Bush, I'm going to say something here that's going to be controversial among our members. There's a big progressive streak in George W.
Without
Bush. He liked to spend other people's money. He liked to use government power. And this was when he came in as a new president, sworn in January of 2001. Now, a few months later, 9/11 would happen, and that would transform his entire presidency. He became a foreign policy, national defense president after 9/11. But before 9/11, for about 6 months, he gave an important speech. He said that the greatest crisis in America at that time was a divorce crisis.
Right.
And he was proposing some kind of new federal program where government employees, government bureaucrats were basically going to become marriage counselors. Can you imagine an unelected government bureaucrat knocking at your door saying, "Dave, we're here from the federal government to make sure your personal relationships is okay."
I can only imagine the lies that would be told.
Yeah.
Right? When we talk about freedom and freedom being dangerous, I mean, think about that in that relationship context.
Yeah.
Is there anything more dangerous in your entire life that you will ever do than going to sleep next to somebody every night? Truly.
You're absolutely right. There's hang on, I'm going to think of her name. She's a professor of social work and sociology. She's in Texas. Brene Brown. Brene Brown, who's kind of something. She's become something of an internet celebrity. She's done some TED Talks they're very popular. I think she's sort of gone off in a more political, progressive direction the last few years. But about 10 years ago, the body of research for which she became famous and was really solid was on the notion of vulnerability, and especially personal vulnerability within relationships. And now she was focusing primarily on the emotional aspect, right? Because to have a real relationship with someone, you got to care about them and you got to let them care about you. And that means they're in a position to hurt you. They can betray you. You got to be strong enough. You have to have the courage to let yourself be vulnerable. But there's also a physical dimension to that. What you're mentioning, just the sheer physical act of going to sleep right next to someone who could, right? They could go pick up a knife and shove it into your throat, and that would be very bad.
All kinds of things.
Yeah.
I mean, you're putting the ultimate trust, and there's total freedom, right? That person has total freedom to do whatever they want. And you're putting a lot of trust.
Yep.
So apply that to other parts of our lives, right? At what point do we say, okay, I don't want the government, I want the freedom in that part of my life,
right?
But I need government to act as my parents in this part of my life. This subjective line that has been drawn by progressives,
right?
Unless maybe there's no line. I mean, maybe a progressive would say, I want the government watching my bedroom every night.
Could be, sure.
I mean, to them,
I'll say this, it wouldn't surprise me. It would be in line because, I mean, think about it, right? In those moments of great vulnerability, the risks are enormous. How about if I say, look, Dave, I'm not going to come sleep with you, right? I don't want to be there, but I'm going to invite you into my pizzeria and I'm going to make a pizza for you. That's it. And I'll trade you, $10, $20. You give me the $20 and I'll give you this. And I make really good pizzas.
Right.
Do you need government looking over me to make sure I have the right licenses, right? And all your friends have told you, hey, Tom makes his pizzas are really good. We really like them. It's a great value for the money. At what point do we need government stepping in saying, we got to be here looking over all these relationships?
At some point, progressives made that decision. And then there was a third step, right? So you have the total freedom, the I'm asleep in my private home, in my bedroom. I don't want the government there.
Right.
You have I own a pizzeria, or I'm going to a pizzeria, and I'm talking from a progressive standpoint. It's not what I believe.
Right.
But progressives would argue, well, I'm going into this pizzeria. I want the government to make sure it's safe.
Right.
And then you get into something like education, where you're no longer even saying, I want the government to tell me this person is okay teaching my children. No, I want government just doing it, right? So you have that stage of there's a line that I don't want you in my bedroom and bathroom with me.
Yep.
Although there's a great South Park episode. I don't know if you remember the South Park episode where they put seatbelts on toilets. Because one of the kids' moms he forgot to put the seat down.
Yes.
And she fell in.
Yeah. They show her all smushed into the toilet.
And it killed her.
Right.
In the show. But the show was about the joke of government regulation. How government can't do anything reasonable. And they had police officers climbing ladders and knocking on your bathroom window saying, here's a ticket, you're not wearing your seatbelt.
Yeah. Good friend of mine has an axiom, and the axiom goes, if there's anything that not only is not rational, but directly contradicts the precepts of reason, very likely government is involved.
That's true. It sounds like a DK comment.
It's very close to a DK comment.
So you have the we want total freedom from government over here, right? Yep. I want the choice to who I'm going to sleep next to. Right. And what if the government all of a sudden was anti-LGBTQ? Could you imagine the progressive attitude of, you can't be in my bedroom.
Right.
I can sleep next to whoever I want to.
Right.
We agree. You can sleep next to whoever you want to. I don't care. You can sleep next to as many people as you want to. I don't care. Then you have the step of the pizzeria. I want government to make sure the pizzeria is safe to the point of, now I want government to just do it for me. And what stops them from saying, I just want government pizzerias.
Right.
Well, they don't want government pizzerias because people like really good pizza,
right.
and the government doesn't do anything
no,
well.
But, I mean, it's interesting, and we're going to get to the subject of education here real soon because we're right on the cusp of it. Government, in addition to schools, they actually do things. Imagine if you're in a city and you own a fitness facility, a gym, and all of a sudden the city government says, we're taking taxpayer money and we're going to build a state-of-the-art rec center. And membership, because we're being subsidized, we're taking money from out of people's taxes, right? We'll charge $5 a month for membership fees because we'll supplement the rest with taxes. And there you are. You own a gym, right? And now you find yourself competing with the government who has this advantage, has this power to just take money from people. You're just a business owner. As a gym owner, you can't take money from anybody.
Yeah.
All you can do is market, your facilities and services.
It's such a good point. You and I have a friend. I don't even know if you know about this, but we have a friend who about a year ago moved up to Boulder, Colorado, and I lived there for a while.
Yeah.
And first thing he did is he called me and says, "Hey, what gym should I go join? I need a gym. What should I go join?"
Yeah.
There's very few good gyms in Boulder. There's really two options. You have the really high end, $150, $180, $200 a month gyms where they're clubs, right? They're fitness clubs.
They're bringing you steamed towels after your workout.
And
I've been in those places.
There's smoothie stations and you're doing all that.
Yep.
And then there's like the CrossFit type thing where it's a very personalized or very specialty.
Right.
There's no just standard gym in Boulder. Why? Because everybody there who doesn't want the fitness club or doesn't want the specialty goes to the University of Colorado Rec Center if they're a student, which is one of the most incredible college gyms you've ever seen. They built a pool in the shape of the Ralphie Buffalo mascot. The pool literally has like legs coming out as hot tubs. I mean, it's insane. So you have that, and then you have a set of the most beautiful rec centers you've ever seen.
Right.
And they're like $25 or $30 a month to be a member.
Cost is no problem when you're spending other people's money.
That's the point. So if you did ever own a gym in Boulder, there was no business for you anymore. You couldn't charge $50, $60 a month.
And this example, right, points to the whole problem. I mean, what is to stop? What's to say? What if a local government said, well, okay, we've been building gyms and that seems to be working. Let's build gas stations. And let's build restaurants, and let's build some clothing stores. And all of a sudden, you basically displace private enterprise and productivity with government managed. This is the socialist creep. This is the path that it goes. And that creep certainly is nowhere more pronounced than really what has likely become the single biggest industry. And I use that word very specifically in the United States, and that's education.
Right.
It's gigantic. State, local governments tend to spend across the United States more on education than anything else. And we were talking about last week in our podcast, and we want to return and kind of dig into this whole subject of what education should be. Going back to that line I love from D.K. Williams, freedom is dangerous, live dangerously. What does it mean to live dangerously? What if you wanted to be a free human being? Intellectually, think freely, make your own choices, make wise choices, live a good life, pursue happiness. What would you need? What kind of education would best prepare you for the life of freedom? And that points to this whole question of what is education? What's the purpose of education? And I think it's impossible to have that conversation without becoming a little philosophic about it.
Sure.
Because it really is connected to the question of, well, what's the purpose of a human being? What is the purpose of life? What is it we should be? Aristotle addresses this all the way back in. Yeah, go ahead.
Before you go down that road, I think we should take a step back. And we've covered this in some toolboxes. We've covered this in some previous podcasts. But I think it would be really worth, before we explore what education should be, let's talk about what the last 250 years have looked like, at least in American education. And we could go back. I mean, we could even go back before America, right? And
Sure.
you had kings and pharaohs and emperors and whatever else deciding who was allowed to be educated, how you qualified to be educated based on religion, based on skin color, based on anything else.
A particularly ugly, nefarious chapter in that story is the chapter of slavery in the United States, where Southern slave states started adopting policies. This is after the Revolution. This is in the early part of the 19th century, in the 1800s, when the abolition movement really gets going. In response to that, many Southern states, starting with Alabama and then Mississippi, adopt legal codes criminalizing teaching people with black skin how to read.
Right.
Turn into a felon. You could be arrested and convicted and put in jail if you taught a slave how to read.
Well, and we can get to this later, but that makes a ton of sense. Why? Because to live freely means you have to have a certain amount of knowledge.
That's right.
You have to understand certain things, and if you have that knowledge, you become dangerous yourself.
That's right.
And you have the opportunity to become more productive.
I'll add in a very particular example. The great abolitionist, former slave Frederick Douglass, who ran away and escaped and lived he devoted the rest of his life to the cause of abolitionism. He gave a rather famous speech in New York, which was a free state.
Right.
And it's on the 4th of July, on the meaning of Independence Day. And it's a famous speech. If our listeners have not read it, you should Google it, Frederick Douglass, Independence Day. It's the title, if I remember right. What to the slave is the 4th of July? Now, here's the curious thing. The date of the speech is July 5th. July 5th because New York State, a free state, there were no slaves. They still had a law that prohibited blacks from gathering and speaking in public on July 4th. Because what's July 4th? July 4th is Independence Day.
Yeah.
People, of course, are talking about the Declaration of Independence and all those ideas and principles. And they did not want large public gatherings of black people talking. So he has to Frederick Douglass gives his speech on July 5th because he's prohibited from giving it on July 4th.
That's terrible.
But this is your point, right? Where governments are deciding who's going to be educated, who's not, who's allowed to read, who's prohibited from reading, all of those sort of things.
So we went through this, and I've talked about this a little bit in the past, that, for Jewish people, there was, from the moment the Romans took Israel, 167 AD, I believe, from the moment the Romans took Israel, the Jewish people were not allowed to be educated.
Right.
There were little tiny moments, but really until under Napoleon in the late 1700s in France was the first time that, and in Western Germany, which Napoleon controlled, was the first time that the Jews were allowed to attend schools.
And this isn't just ancient history. We've been talking about personal friends here today. We have a mutual friend. I have been to his Seder dinner many times at his house. It's always I look forward to the thing. I probably enjoy the wine a little too much, but it's
the point of the holiday.
It's wonderful. Anyway, he grew up.
By the way,
yeah.
Talk about favorite holidays earlier.
Yeah.
That's one of mine.
Seder.
Passover is up there for me. It's always one of the best.
Well, and I mean, the Seder dinner is fantastic because it's the story of freedom.
Yeah.
It is the story of why slavery is wrong and why freedom is good. It's a beautiful story. And so this friend of ours, he grew up in the former Soviet Union. His father is now here, and his father has attended many of these Seders with us. His father, in the Soviet Union, religion effectively was a crime. And there was no synagogue. So his father, who was Jewish, grew up never going to synagogue, really knowing virtually nothing about his own religion, his own religious heritage. It's only after they emigrated to the United States that he's been able to study and learn and worship and reconnect. And so now we get together here in the United States. There I am, a non-Jew, right, at the Seder dinner. But my friend Len, his dad is there, and he's absorbing this stuff. He never got to learn these things as a kid. It was a crime under the government where he lived.
Yeah. So we go through that whole period, and then you get into let's say the the first period of the United States, right? Post 1776, before the Civil War.
Okay.
Education looked very different than we understand it today. Education was usually for very young ages, and usually unless you had an aspiration and the means to go become a doctor or go become something that required additional levels of education, somewhere between 6th and 8th grade, you would leave.
Pretty typical.
You'd leave school and you'd start as an apprentice. You would start an apprenticeship where you would learn. And for those who haven't read it, and I think I've talked about this before, Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, he talks quite a bit about that. He left school in 8th grade.
And Franklin was he was a coastal, Philadelphia, big city. When you get out into the prairies, into the Midwest, the experience of a Lincoln is almost more common. Lincoln used to joke about this, that if you added all the time that he spent his family was always moving around from Kentucky to Indiana, then they end up in Illinois. And so he's in these different schools. But he said all the time in school added together was less than 1 year.
Huh.
Total.
Wow. I didn't know that.
And this
That's
is the man,
amazing.
And this is the man who would go on to write the Gettysburg Address.
Right.
That kind of experience wasn't uncommon or unknown.
So you had that, and it was really about finding schools, about giving you that real foundation of the things you'd need to know: how to write, how to read, how to do math, the basic math, and then if you needed things beyond that, you'd learn them during an apprenticeship.
Yep.
And what was interesting about those, and I've as some of the autobiographies and biographies I've read, usually what would be the opposite of the apprentice. The apprentice had whoever was training them.
Right. The trainee.
The trainer.
Oh, the trainer. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Whoever you were apprenticing for
Yeah.
would usually take you in, would give you room and board, would give you food, would take care of you. That was part of your compensation for being an apprentice.
I'll throw in a little trivia here since we're talking education. That old model, really, this stretches all the way back to the medieval guild system. The young men who needed to learn some kind of trade so they could provide for themselves and their families, they tended to be single young men. They were bachelors. They would study under someone who had mastered a certain art, right? Whether that's pounding out the iron, the blacksmith, or something, whatever it was. We use those terms, master and bachelor, in our degree system in our universities today, right? You go for 4 years and you get your bachelor's degree and then your master's, and then, for us goofy ones, we keep on going and become doctor. Although even there, the PhD, the Doctor of Philosophy, the Latin root of the word doctor, the doctora, really it means the exact same thing as what the word rabbi means in ancient Hebrew, which is wise person. It's just a wise person. It really doesn't signify anything about being holy or special. Just this is a wise person. That's what a doctor is. That's what a rabbi is, wise person. We've incorporated that into our education.
So fast forward, we get through the Civil War, we get through the late part of the 19th century, the late 1800s, and then we start getting the early days of progressivism.
Yeah.
And for the sake of time, you can probably go through this faster than I can.
Yeah.
So I just ask, why don't you take everybody through the brief history of the progressive transformation of education?
Well, there's a couple of important pieces here to emphasize. And there's a name that looms over everyone else in this realm, and that name is John Dewey, D-E-W-E-Y.
The Dewey Decimal System for those.
Dewey is connected to Dewey's often held up as academics will say he's one of only 2 or 3 genuine, real, authentic, philosophic minds. I don't know that I agree with that. I would add a Lincoln up there, but academics aren't impressed with a Lincoln. And he revamps the model of education along progressive lines. And several things come out of that. I mean, he almost single-handedly, I don't want to overstate it, but at the same time, I want to give him credit or blame where it's due. He really dreamt up this idea of education schools, teacher schools, where people go to learn. They don't go to learn math or history or chemistry or any discipline. They go to learn how to teach, how to be a teacher. And they get a degree in education because his view was what matters most is to centralize the curriculum for training teachers so that they would go out. And from Dewey's point of view, this is why we can have teachers with education degrees. It doesn't really matter if they know math or know history or know any of these things. I mean, he wasn't opposed to it. It was just very second order of importance. What matters most is shaping the character, shaping the souls, shaping the attitudes of young Americans so that they can become good subjects, so that they will be compliant, so that they will be submissive to the progressive central planning regime all around them, coupled with a big emphasis in the modern progressive realm of education, learning certain practical skills so you can get a job, so you can be productive, because the central planning government is laying out a central plan, and they need a certain number of people to go grow crops, and they need people to run the factories, and they need people to administer medicine, right? And so this really comes through today. You see this where in the actual curricula of public schools, what's in the curricula is often influenced by the latest reports coming out of the Department of Labor and coming out of government agencies saying we need more workers with these kinds of skills. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting it's bad to learn a skill or be able to know how to do something, but it's a very different model of education than the older form that the founders were familiar with. The founders weren't educated that way. The founders were reading the great minds, right. Classical writers, medieval writers, that were raising the great high human questions. What is the human good? What is good for human beings? What is happiness? Are people mistaken about what happiness is? Do they choose poorly when they're trying to achieve or pursue happiness? They wanted to be able to think well about those high human questions because they were thinking about freedom and independence, not merely in a political way. I mean, political, right? We want to be free. We don't want to be slaves. We want to be free, but also intellectually, emotionally, as an individual human being. I want to be able to think for myself, reason for myself. I know there are these authoritative institutions out there, schools, churches, popular culture, what's in the media, and they're going to be feeding us lots of things, some of which might be true, a lot of which are lies or mistakes or prejudices. And a truly free human being is able to think well, think through all the informations and opinions and arguments that they're receiving. And that was the classical kind of model. Progressive education says, no, learn your task, the thing that you're going to go do as part of the, right. So you can contribute to the regime, to the economy, and be submissive, be compliant.
You said something that stood out to me. You said when Dewey was designing this, he said he wasn't opposed to people knowing anything.
Right.
But I kind of question that. And we don't know. I mean, right? He never came out saying, I don't want you to learn anything.
He never said nobody should know mathematics. He didn't say that.
But to an extent, I wonder if he did, because you talk about that master's slave mentality. There was a benefit for him as a central planner that his teachers, the people he was training to be teachers, didn't know anything other than how to teach.
Right.
Because it made them less likely to go out and try to teach in a different way. If they didn't know the subject matter, if they were just trying to stay one lesson ahead of their students, they couldn't go design a new curriculum. They couldn't go change the way they're teaching. They had to do exactly what they were taught to do and use the curriculum they were given.
I'm going to summarize it this way. Within Dewey, and again, Dewey, I mean, I don't want our listeners to think that we're talking about Dewey as some historical, antiquated figure from the past. When I say Dewey, I'm talking about our public schools today. They very much are a reflection of the designs made by John Dewey. Dewey type of public education is an education model that really downplays knowledge. Knowledge is of secondary importance, if maybe none at all. The classical view, in fact, I've got a little, we put on our case study, I'll hold it up here for people watching this on video. It's an old Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. And the whole cartoon strip is a typical day at school for Calvin. And he's going through one terrible experience. This is how he perceives school. And part of it is like he's on a conveyor belt, right? And his brain's being opened up and just a bunch of knowledge is being dumped in there. The old model of education, this is where we get things like the trivium and the quadrivium. This goes all the way back to the classical Greek thinkers. Education should include knowledge. It's not anti-knowledge, but it's knowledge and more. I mean, young kids should know they live on a planet and the planet has continents, right? And there are countries here and you live in a body and the body needs nutrition and hydration, right?
Sure.
And there are just facts about the world everyone should know. But classical education was more than just the facts. It was also how to think about these things. I just mentioned there's an earth, there are continents, there are countries. What about those countries? Are some better than others? Are some more just? Are some more unjust? Well, what are these concepts of justice and injustice, right? That's more than just knowing the facts about your physical surrounding. It's how to observe things, judge things well, have some frame of reference, all of which is kind of surrounded or framed by this notion of human well-being, human happiness. And that's mostly gone in the modern model of education. To this point, starting with that first part of the students should know some knowledge. We have a very good friend who runs, I'm going to give him credit where credit's due. Bob Schaefer runs the best school in Colorado.
It's one of the best in the country.
Yeah, and I'm not just making that up. I mean, people who measure schools, who rank them, right? And whether they go by test scores or whatever their criteria are, Bob's school up in Fort Collins is at the top.
Correct.
Consistently. And he'll talk quite openly about the great challenge of finding teachers, because one of the questions he asks when they have a job opening, they need a teacher, people apply, and he gets lots of applications from people who have teacher's degrees. And he'll ask this simple question. Do you view yourself as a teacher? Are you there to share the knowledge you have, or are you there to ask students what they think and feel about things? And the vast majority of these applicants will say, well, I'm there to facilitate, to just ask them what they think and feel. And he's like, thank you very much. We're done with this interview. He wants people who actually know something.
Right.
He hired their science teacher one of them is a retired chemist who spent most of his career working at a big pharmaceutical company as a chemist. This guy is a PhD chemist. And so he's there, right, teaching science. And his job should not be to ask students, what do you think chemistry is? How do you feel about chemistry? Right? It's to impart to students, here are the basic building blocks of chemistry you should know. And then but it's more than that, right? Because going back, I think sometime in a recent podcast we mentioned that great scene in Jurassic Park where Ian, the mathematician, he says, John, you were so busy figuring out whether you could do something, you never asked yourself, should you?
Right.
Is this the right thing to do? That requires the ability to engage in moral reasoning, moral logic, as well as prudence. All these things start to come together. So you need the knowledge, you need the content, and you need a lot more. And that used to be kind of the basis of a traditional liberal arts. I mean, that phrase is kind of curious, right? Liberal arts. The arts, the ways, the crafts, the sciences of a free person.
Right.
Of liberty, right? If you're going to be a free human being, what do you need to do to use your liberty well, to make a good life out of your liberty? The way we're talking here about education would be alien. I mean, really unfamiliar to many ordinary teachers today.
Well, but you think about the greatest minds in the history of the world, how that what is alien to people today is actually what created those minds. And to use a word we talk about a lot, created diversity among the minds. You take this back to this idea that I'm going to present you with my knowledge. If I'm this chemistry teacher, I'm going to teach you some things about chemistry. I'm going to give you enough, and there's going to be a handful of students in that class who say, wait a minute, there's something really interesting here. And as I'm exploring my place in this world, I'm exploring how do I be a productive, valuable, virtuous member of my community, of society as a whole. There's something really interesting you shared here. I'm going to go learn more. I'm going to take it upon myself, and I'm going to go learn more. And then there's going to be people in that class who say, okay, you gave me the foundation.
I get it.
that was me, right? I hated chemistry. That was just not my thing. Put me in a physics class, I was in heaven. I could talk about cars and how cars work and everything else. Chemistry, not so much. But then you get somebody in a history class. I'm going to teach you a little bit about history. And if they look at it from the perspective of, well, what's my role as a virtuous, productive citizen?
Right.
Okay, so I got to go do something. This really clicks with me. And I see this opportunity. And then they start to go learn more. And you look back through history. And I'm not even talking about 1,000 years. I'm not talking about going back to Aristotle. I use two examples of very, very intelligent people who necessarily didn't have deep education, one more than the other. But we talked about Franklin, who Franklin said, wait a minute, there's something about politics here and more. He needed to understand math too, right? He was working at a printing press. I got to understand math. I'm going to go read about it. I'm going to go study it. And then he said, there's something about the way social interactions work. And I'm going to go read what the great thinkers did. And then they brought people together, whether it was Franklin with his leather apron club and this whole idea of I'm going to get my friends together and we're going to talk about it. I don't need school. We're just going to talk about it. They were his colleagues, which we've talked about is the root of college. The other guy, and the other example, is somebody who was probably just as capable of having those same conversations Franklin was, but his interest drove him to further exploration of math and science, and that was Einstein, right? And Einstein, there was only so much that Einstein was going to learn from somebody else.
Right.
He got his foundation, he got his base, and he said, I have a bigger place in this world. I have a bigger place in society. And he started participating in symposiums. And he started going out and saying, here's a theory, challenge me. Let's push each other. I'm going to explore these equations and these ideas. But you could go back to Galileo, you could go back to Newton. I mean, you have these guys who...
Well, it's sort of fascinating. I would have made a list because if I had prepared for this, but I didn't think we'd go in this direction. But it's also true. Many of the pivotal thinkers in the history of philosophy and science had little or no formal education at all. Francis Bacon, in a way, is the innovator of modern technological science. That is science devoted to mastering, harnessing, controlling nature so that we can make things with it, turn nature into devices and medicines and things that what we think of as technology. This begins with Francis Bacon, who never went to college.
Right.
There's a whole line of key. Descartes was the same. David Hume was the same. Very little higher education for these people, and it kind of points to something we mentioned last time that's worth restating and emphasizing. What we've done with this whole notion of education, simultaneously, we've placed too much importance on schools and what happens. And at the same time, we've perverted and corrupted and denigrated what actually goes on in those schools. I mean, education it should be a lifelong activity for most human beings. Now, we're not the only beings who learn. There are other learning creatures. I'll throw this at my wife and I just watched. This is really fun. It's a little hour-long special on a guy who dives in the ocean every day with an octopus. I think the name is My Octopus Tea. It's goofy, but we had so much fun watching it. It's a little tiny octopus, and he goes down where this octopus lives every single day for like 360 days, and it turns out the lifespan of an octopus is very short. And he starts to form this kind of, weird relationship with this octopus. And one of the things you see is the octopus learns. The octopus, he shows he's trying to catch these lobsters, and the way he's doing it, the lobster would always get away, and then he changes how he hunts he's learning. Oh, the octopus can get through my tentacles this way, so he throws himself over the top, so when the lobster takes off, he catches him. And that's just one goofy example. There are many animals that learn. Human beings are the only learning animal who can think about how to learn.
Right.
Make a plan to learn. Make a plan, prepare for how to help others learn, right? There is no octopus writing a curriculum for future octopi. Hey, I just discovered this way to catch live, right? Each one has to go experience it on their own and try to learn for themselves. Whereas human beings we can think about education. How do we want to learn? How do we want our children to learn?
Right.
How do we want other people to learn? And we've come to place this enormous emphasis on school. Learning takes place at school, rather than thinking the truth is learning takes place all day long, every day. No matter what we do, we're learning, whether we want to learn or not. Sometimes we learn things we didn't want to learn. Sometimes we learn some really unpleasant truths about other people or about the world, and there's that whole realm. And then what we've done within the schools is we've perverted and corrupted the goals, the ends of the institutions of schools. We've infused into the curriculum this mishmash of things that very often are not only not helpful for young human beings, they're positively harmful.
Right.
Teaching little kids that they're victims, that they should be angry at everybody around them, rather than equipping them with the tools to go be an independent, free human being. And then in the middle of it, this is a point you've made, we have a bunch of teachers, some of whom might be actually nefarious and actually have bad agendas, but I don't think many. I think the vast bulk of teachers are there, and all of a sudden they're put in a position, they said, okay, you now are our history teacher, you're our chemistry teacher, you're our math teacher, and they haven't been prepared for it. They haven't mastered math or chemistry or history. They went and got their education degree, and so they are scrambling all the time to stay a little bit ahead in the textbook of where the class is.
And when they're just trying to do that, and it's not a topic that they're really that they care about. I've been around teachers who they teach, whether it's history or statistics or whatever it is, the teachers who teach younger kids that do it for a passion, that they have a passion for those kids and for that curriculum. Even if they don't know it on day one, they make a point to go learn about it. They spend time in the summers. They spend time after school. They spend time on the weekends learning more about those things. And you see that growth over time. Most of these teachers, they have the tenure. And they're government bureaucrats in a lot of ways. And they don't even know, will I be teaching the same thing next year? They don't invest in it because our system is not designed for them to invest in it. The bigger thing about what you said, and I want to make sure nobody missed it, you made the comment that we've placed too much emphasis on the education part, on the school part, right, on being in school. And even more so, I'd add to that, the pieces of paper you get along the way, we've put such a high priority on it that people think, well, if I'm not getting that piece of paper along the way, then it's not worth learning. Yep. And that's why we've stopped spending time learning and getting an education outside of school. Yep. And why people are racking up tens of thousands of dollars in debt, because I have to get that paper. Yep. It has nothing to do with whether I'm learning and I'm being prepared to go do something productive. So I just need that paper because they're telling me I can't be successful. And that same mentality goes all the way back to the same mentality that we had, that you were talking about with kids in preschool and kindergarten, teaching them they're victims. Yeah. Right? At no point are you teaching these kids, if you learn how to do these things, I don't care if you have a piece of paper or not. Right. If you learn how to provide value to somebody else, you can be successful.
You can create wealth.
Right. And we've just developed this whole mentality. So,
here's part of the older idea of education that's virtually gone. If you learn what the moral virtues are and you practice them and you exercise them, you're going to be a happier person. Right. You're going to live a better life.
Well, and you're going to be able to be in relationships, both friendships and romantic and business with other people, because you're both striving for the same thing. And I think one of the problems we have in the country today is people aren't striving for the same thing. And I've had a lot of people comment over the last few years, I've heard it over and over again, that I can't date a person of the opposite political party. Right. And everybody says, I Can't understand why. Well, it's not so much the party. It's, do you share the value of being a productive, virtuous person?
Yep.
Or do you share the value of, I'm just looking for somebody to make sure I'm safe and secure and taken care of?
Yep.
And if you don't share that value, it's almost impossible to have a relationship with somebody.
You've been emphasizing how much importance people place on these degrees and these pieces of paper. And I wanted to share a very personal story of just how little those things can mean. I did my graduate work at a fairly elite private graduate school out in California. And listeners of this program have probably heard me refer to my friend James Harrigan before. We went through the graduate program together. And part of getting a PhD is you take these big comprehensive exams. You are supposed to know the important literature in your discipline so that you can, number one, you can go out and teach that. And number two, you take these exams before you write your dissertation. The dissertation, you're supposed to contribute. Whatever the body of knowledge is in your discipline, you first have to show that you know the research that's been done, and then your dissertation is a way of adding more research, right? Adding to your discipline.
Sure.
So these big comprehensive exams tend to be 8-9 hours long, and they put you in a little room. When I took it, it was there were only 3 of us in there. James and I were both in there too. We had prepared together. And there was this young woman who had been in many of our classes. We knew her. We weren't real close friends with her, but we knew who she was. And so we start in the morning. We're at a keyboard. We're typing our answers. And some of these questions were big softball questions, like describe the literature on Congress. Within my discipline, political science, there is a big body of literature on Congress. So you were supposed to, and then there would be more specific, more nuanced and detailed academic scholarly questions. So we were working for 3 or 4 hours, and they gave us a little lunch break. At the lunch break, I think I had written 10 or 11 pages. I've never learned how to type. To this day, Dave, I've written multiple books.
I've noticed that.
You know, I did. So I was there doing my hunting and pecking thing. My friend Jim, he's a good type. He had 14 or 15 pages. As we walked out, the young woman with us, she had one sentence written on one page. And we were thinking, something doesn't seem right here. Anyway, we went and grabbed our lunch and came back, and we're working. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she got up and she slammed her chair against the wall, and she threw out the F-bomb, F this racist institution. And she walked out. Okay, well, I guess she's done. Years later, I see her name in a news article, and she has the letters PhD behind her name. And I went and looked up. The same school that I went to awarded her a PhD in multicultural studies, which was a degree when we were in school. They didn't offer that degree. That means they literally created this degree, and she's walking around the world as this PhD in cultural studies.
So she can tell people how racist different things are.
That's right.
That's her.
Because she was angry. Would not surprise me at all if she threatened some lawsuit or something like that. And so this goes up to the very highest level, that those pieces of paper are not synonymous with a good education, and they're certainly not synonymous with thinking well.
Right. So let's summarize this whole thing, because if we're talking about what education should look like, and we could probably spend hours more, and maybe we will, maybe we won't, but what education should look like at its very foundation, and there's a lot of ways to skin the cat, as they say. I don't know if that's an appropriate term to use. Yeah. The way to do this, the very foundation of what should education be, education should inspire somebody to want to explore further on their own. Should be a lifelong pursuit. It should not be you get this in school, and once you're done with school,
you're done.
You're done.
Yeah.
Right? You've learned everything you could possibly need to know.
That.
And if you don't need to know it, if you didn't learn it in school, it's probably bad.
Yep.
Right? I mean, that's sort of the message now.
I'll put it this way. If you think of your life as a journey on a road trip, your degrees are like rest stops or stop and forget. They're just places that you stop, but you keep on going on your journey. There's still a lot of road to be traveled after you get your degree.
And then the second part of education is it should not be about the pure basic pursuit of just knowledge. It should be, how does that knowledge apply to a virtuous, productive life?
That's right.
And if we could start at a young age teaching kids those two things, that one, what you learn, you don't give up learning the minute you leave school. Education is a lifetime. School is just a check-in. It's a way station along the way if you're using
and you
the
know
gas
what's
station
interesting?
Analogy.
This isn't what you and I are talking about here. This isn't just theory or speculation. This is woven into human nature. Even at the youngest ages, kindergarten or pre-kindergarten, preschools, those kids are talking.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting? They show up and they're talking. Now, some are more advanced in their speech, some are less advanced, but they're talking. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in school. And how'd they learn that? That most important of all human things to learn, right? Speech, articulate speech, how to speak. They didn't learn that because of some curriculum from some teacher. They learned it because as babies, they're listening to the people around them talk, and they start to babble, and they start to imitate, and they start talking on their own.
And what's the one word they use the most when they start to get to that age where they go to school? Why?
Why?
Right? They want to know more. They're looking for answers. They're looking to learn more. I mean, it's inherent in their nature.
Yep.
So teach kids that education is not just a part of school.
Yep.
Education and learning is
all the time,
all day, every day, from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep till the day you die.
In fact, we have said within the Vino Veritas Society, we have said on various occasions, life is synonymous with productivity. That to choose to live as opposed to death, if you want to live, you got to be productive somehow. You got to use your mind, your body. You got to do something. In the same way, life is also learning. If you choose to live, you are choosing to learn whether you recognize it or not.
That's the perfect segue into my second point, because the second point is learning should be about being productive and virtuous and valuable to yourself, to your community, to your society. Now, you're doing it for your own betterment, right? I'm not suggesting you don't go learn what the community needs you to learn for the sake of the community.
Right.
You learn what the community needs you to learn so that you can provide value to others, so you can be productive, and so that you can earn and create wealth.
For yourself.
For yourself.
That's right.
For a better life, for a happier life, for a productive life. And if you're going to define, I mean, we've had one chapter, 2 chapters have their meetings already, but as our chapters keep getting together, if you're thinking about this as a digital subscriber, it starts with those 2 things. If you can focus on those 2 things, build education around that, and we would have a much healthier, productive society rather than a society that's completely reliant on government.
Amen to that. And it's why these ideas we're talking about require protection. They need guardians, and that's what we do. We are going to guard these ideas.
Nos somos custodes.
Till next time.